Mick Philpott was a man who thrived on control and attention. Born in 1956 in Derby, England, his early life offered few clues about the notoriety he would later gain. By the time he reached adulthood, however, Mick had become a master manipulator, building a reputation for his domineering behavior and controversial lifestyle. He first came to national attention not for his crimes, but for the highly unusual dynamics of his household. Living in a council house in Derby, Mick shared his home with his wife, Mairead, his mistress, Lisa Willis, and their combined children, 17 in total. It was a setup that raised eyebrows, but Mick seemed to relish the scrutiny. His household, entirely funded by state benefits, became his stage. He even appeared on television programs like The Jeremy Kyle Show and documentaries, where he boasted about his lifestyle and derided critics. To Mick, these appearances were not just a chance to defend himself but an opportunity to bask in the limelight. Beneath the surface, however, life inside the Philpott home was far from harmonious. Mick was a deeply controlling figure, especially toward the women in his life. Both Mairead and Lisa were subject to his rules and his temper, and their lives revolved around his demands. Friends and neighbors would later describe Mick as someone who thrived on dominance, whether in his relationships or in the public eye. But the cracks in this seemingly bizarre yet functioning arrangement began to show when Lisa Willis, after years of enduring Mick's control, decided to leave. She took her 5 children, 4 of whom Mick fathered, and walked out of the house one day, determined to start a new life. For Mick, it was an act of defiance he couldn't tolerate. Lisa's departure wasn't just the loss of a partner or even his children. It was a direct challenge to his authority, and he wasn't prepared to let it go. As Lisa started over, Mick began to plot. His determination to regain control and punish Lisa for her perceived betrayal would soon set off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. What started as a household defined by dysfunction and control was now on the path to tragedy. A tragedy that would horrify a nation and forever etch Mick Philpott's name into infamy. Lisa Willis's departure from the Philpott household marked a pivotal moment in the story. By the time she left in early 2012, Mick Philpott's control over his unusual family dynamic had been broken. For years, Lisa had endured Mick's rules and his oppressive demeanor. She was the secondary figure in Mick's life, living in the shadow of Mairead, his wife, and yet expected to serve Mick's demands without question. But something had changed. Lisa decided she'd had enough. The day she left was both meticulously planned and fueled by quiet desperation. Without informing Mick, Lisa packed up her belongings and those of her 5 children, including 4 fathered by Mick. She slipped away, seeking refuge in a women's shelter. It was a bold and dangerous move, as Lisa knew Mick would not take her departure lightly. For someone like Mick, whose entire persona was built on maintaining control, Lisa's decision to leave was not just an act of defiance. It was a blow to his identity. When Mick discovered that Lisa was gone, his response was immediate and calculated. He was enraged, but anger alone wasn't enough for him. Mick was determined to bring Lisa back under his control, not just to reassert his authority, but to prevent her from gaining independence. More importantly, her absence threatened his financial setup. Lisa's children had been a significant source of income through state benefits, and without them, Mick's carefully constructed lifestyle was at risk. Instead of reflecting on why Lisa had left, Mick became fixated on revenge. He began by seeking legal action, filing for custody of the children she had taken with her. Mick was convinced the courts would side with him, painting Lisa as unfit and unstable. But when his legal efforts didn't yield immediate results, Mick's frustration grew. He began talking to friends and neighbors about how Lisa had wronged him, portraying himself as the victim of betrayal. Yet beneath the surface, his mind was working on something far more sinister. Mick's manipulation extended beyond the courtroom and his immediate circle. He tried to track Lisa down, using threats and coercion to gather information on her whereabouts. Mick's need for control was obsessive, and he was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to reassert it. However, as time passed and Lisa remained out of his reach, Mick's focus shifted. If he couldn't bring Lisa back, he decided he would make her suffer in a way she'd never forget. It was during this time that Mick's plotting began to escalate. He spoke openly with Mairead about his frustrations, and hatched a plan to retaliate against Lisa in the most devastating way possible. Mairead, deeply under Mick's control and eager to please him, was complicit in his growing schemes. Together, they devised a way to hit Lisa where it would hurt the most: her freedom, her stability, and her children. What started as bitter resentment quickly evolved into a dark and calculated plan. Mick believed he could use drama and chaos to manipulate public sympathy and turn the system in his favor. But what he didn't account for was the irreversible chain of events his schemes would set in motion. By mid-2012, Mick Philpott's desperation had reached its peak. Losing Lisa Willis and the 5 children she had taken with her was a blow to his sense of dominance, his finances, and his public image. But rather than accepting the loss, Mick began devising a plan to not only retaliate against Lisa, but to use the situation to his advantage. What followed was a chilling descent into one of the most shocking crimes in modern UK history. Mick's twisted plan hinged on a carefully orchestrated disaster. He decided to stage a house fire in the family's Derby home, a fire that he intended to blame on Lisa. His warped logic was that such a tragedy would portray him as a grieving father and victim of Lisa's alleged malice, which would win him public sympathy, media attention, and potentially custody of the children. More than anything, Mick wanted to regain control, and he saw this plan as the ultimate opportunity to achieve it. Mick shared his plan with Mairead, his wife, who was still firmly under his influence. Mairead, caught in the toxic dynamic of their relationship and eager to please Mick, agreed to go along with the scheme. Mick also enlisted the help of Paul Mosley, a family friend and occasional accomplice in Mick's life. Together, the 3 conspired to execute the fire while ensuring that they, and, most importantly, their children, would emerge unharmed. In Mick's mind, the plan was flawless. The fire would start in the early hours of the morning, giving them enough time to stage a dramatic rescue and escape. The children, all of whom slept on the 2nd floor, would be removed safely, and Mick would appear as a hero and a victim in one fell swoop. But Mick's plans, however detailed they seemed, overlooked the unpredictable and uncontrollable nature of fire. In the early hours of May 11, 2012, Mick, Mairead, and Mosley put their plan into action. They poured petrol in various parts of the house, focusing on the front entrance and hallway, areas they believed would burn quickly while allowing for a safe exit through the back. At approximately 4 a.m., they ignited the fire and immediately began screaming for help to create the appearance of chaos and urgency. The fire spread faster than Mick had anticipated. Thick smoke quickly engulfed the house, and the flames intensified. Mick and Mairead fled the house, but made no real effort to save the 6 children sleeping upstairs. Their screams filled the air, drawing the attention of neighbors who rushed to help. Emergency services were called, and fire crews arrived within minutes, but by then, the house was already consumed by smoke and flames. The firefighters worked tirelessly to rescue the children trapped inside. Tragically, despite their efforts, the fire proved fatal for all but one of the children. Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden, ranging in age from 5 to 13, succumbed to smoke inhalation. The youngest, Duane, was pulled from the house alive, but later died in the hospital from his injuries. The deaths of the 6 children shocked the community and left the nation reeling. The Philpotts, appearing distraught and grief-stricken, gave interviews and public statements, portraying themselves as devastated parents who had lost everything. Mick, in particular, played the role of a heartbroken father, shedding tears on camera and calling for justice. But the story was far from over. The tragedy had captured the nation's attention, and as investigators delved deeper into the events of that fateful night, the cracks in Mick's carefully constructed narrative began to emerge. What seemed like an unimaginable accident was about to be revealed as a calculated and callous crime. The aftermath of the fire left a community grappling with sorrow and disbelief. 6 children, all from one family, had lost their lives in what initially appeared to be a devastating accident. Mick and Mairead Philpott, mourning parents in the public eye, garnered sympathy from neighbors and media alike. But behind closed doors, the facade began to crack. The first hints of suspicion arose when investigators began their meticulous examination of the fire. The Derbyshire Fire and Rescue Service determined that the blaze was not caused by an accident. Instead, it was deliberately started, with petrol found as the accelerant. This revelation turned what was once seen as a tragedy into a potential crime scene. The police immediately launched a criminal investigation, intent on uncovering who was responsible. Detectives started piecing together the events of the night. Witness testimonies provided crucial details, and neighbors recounted hearing screaming and chaos as the fire erupted. But as they delved deeper, the accounts given by Mick and Mairead seemed inconsistent. Mick, in particular, appeared overly composed in moments when genuine grief would have been expected. Investigators noted his peculiar behavior during interviews, including a tendency to steer conversations away from probing questions. The turning point came when CCTV footage from nearby cameras was analyzed. It revealed key movements around the Philpott home in the hours leading up to the fire. This, combined with forensic evidence, painted a damning picture. Detectives discovered traces of petrol on clothing belonging to Mick, Mairead, and Paul Mosley, a family friend who had been present that night. As the evidence mounted, police focused on the Philpotts' motives. Financial records and social services documents highlighted the ongoing custody battle between Mick and Lisa Willis. Mick's obsession with control, particularly over Lisa and the children she had taken with her, became a central theme. Investigators theorized that the fire was a calculated attempt to frame Lisa, gain public sympathy, and potentially regain custody of the children through legal means. Mick and Mairead were arrested on suspicion of manslaughter just weeks after the fire. The community, still reeling from the tragedy, struggled to process the shocking turn of events. The public perception of the Philpotts shifted dramatically. Their televised appeals, once seen as heartfelt pleas for justice, were now scrutinized as performances. Mick's behavior in particular, his composed demeanor, rehearsed statements, and apparent lack of genuine emotion, became clear signs of deceit in hindsight. During police interviews, Mick remained defiant. He denied any involvement in the fire, casting himself as a victim and accusing the authorities of targeting him unfairly. Mairead, on the other hand, began to show cracks in her resolve. She appeared visibly distressed during questioning, struggling to maintain the facade of innocence. Investigators leveraged this, applying pressure on both her and Mosley. Paul Mosley's role in the crime also became evident during the investigation. Phone records and witness statements placed him at the scene on the night of the fire. Initially defiant, Mosley eventually admitted to being present during the planning stages, but tried to minimize his role, claiming he had been manipulated by Mick. As the police built their case, the weight of evidence became overwhelming. Witness testimonies, forensic findings, and the inconsistencies in the Philpott stories pointed to a horrifying truth. The fire that claimed the lives of 6 innocent children was the result of a calculated plot by their own parents. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once rallied around Mick and Mairead, organizing vigils and offering support, were now grappling with feelings of betrayal. The trial, which loomed on the horizon, promised to expose the full extent of the Philpotts' actions and motives. The trial of Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott, and Paul Mosley began in early 2013 at Nottingham Crown Court, drawing widespread media attention. The tragedy of 6 young lives lost, compounded by the shocking allegations against the parents, had captured the nation's attention. The prosecution presented a detailed case, seeking to prove that the fire was a deliberate act orchestrated by Mick Philpott, with Mairead and Mosley as co-conspirators. From the outset, the prosecution painted Mick as the mastermind behind the plot. His controlling and manipulative nature was central to the narrative. Testimonies revealed how Mick had treated his partners and children more as possessions than loved ones, ruling the household with fear and intimidation. The prosecution argued that Mick's primary motive was to frame Lisa Willis and regain custody of the children she had taken when she left him. They pointed to his obsession with public image, suggesting that Mick believed the fire would earn him sympathy, media attention, and a favorable outcome in the custody dispute. Key evidence was presented to the court, including CCTV footage, phone records, and forensic findings. The petrol traces found on clothing belonging to Mick, Mairead, and Mosley were damning. Forensic experts testified that the fire had been started with petrol poured through the letterbox of the Philpott home, causing an inferno that rapidly engulfed the property. The placement of the accelerant was deliberate, ensuring that the fire would spread quickly and leave no time for those inside to escape. The prosecution also highlighted Mick's behavior in the immediate aftermath of the fire. His seemingly rehearsed appeals for information on live television were played for the jury, juxtaposed with footage of genuine grief displayed by others who had suffered similar tragedies. Witnesses testified to Mick's strange composure and his apparent lack of genuine emotional distress in private. Mairead's role in the crime became a focal point as well. The prosecution argued that while she may have been under Mick's control, she was still complicit in the plan. Her demeanor in court alternated between subdued and defensive, but her earlier interviews with the police revealed inconsistencies that undermined her claims of innocence. Paul Mosley, meanwhile, attempted to portray himself as a reluctant participant, claiming he had been pressured by Mick. However, his phone records and his presence at the Philpott home on the night of the fire made it clear he was actively involved. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Mick Philpott maintained his innocence, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance and media persecution. His arrogance, however, worked against him in the courtroom. At one point, he openly chastised witnesses and even criticized the legal process, behavior that did little to garner sympathy from the jury or the public. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Mick and Mairead Philpott were found guilty of manslaughter, along with Paul Mosley. The court ruled that while they had not intended to kill the children, their reckless actions in starting the fire had directly caused the deaths. The sentences reflected the gravity of the crime. Mick received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Mairead and Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years in prison. The sentencing judge did not hold back in his condemnation of Mick Philpott. He described Mick as a disturbingly dangerous man whose actions were driven by selfishness and a pathological need for control. The judge acknowledged that Mairead and Mosley had been under Mick's influence, but emphasized that this did not absolve them of responsibility for their roles in the tragedy. The aftermath of the trial saw an outpouring of grief and anger from the public. Vigils were held for the 6 children, Duane, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden, who had lost their lives in such a senseless and horrific manner. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the welfare system, domestic abuse, and the devastating consequences of unchecked control and manipulation within families. Mick Philpott became a symbol of moral decay in some circles, and his name was frequently invoked in debates about social policies and the justice system. Mairead and Mosley's complicity in the crime was also scrutinized, with many questioning whether they, too, had been victims of Mick's manipulative nature or willing participants in his schemes. The legacy of the Philpott case remains a chilling reminder of how a desire for control and manipulation can lead to unspeakable tragedy. For the community of Derby and the nation as a whole, it was a moment of reckoning, a story of loss, betrayal, and the resilience of those determined to seek justice for the innocent lives lost. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified as we add new videos daily. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.